You were never meant to hear this. In 1862, under the floorboards of a forgotten church in upstate New York, 143 skeletons were discovered, each one bearing signs of prolonged intentional torture, bones shattered and rehealed, markings etched directly into femurs, and evidence of drowning, not once, but repeatedly. But what was more chilling than the remains was the silence that followed. No newspaper headlines, no federal inquiry, no trial, just silence, sealed documents, and a name whispered only in the corridors of classified government records: the Ravencroft family. Now listen closely, because this is not just a story, it is a key, a map to the hidden architecture of power, a power that does not ask permission, it demands sacrifice. In the early 1800s, the American frontier was burning with spiritual hunger. The so-called Second Great Awakening swept through the northeastern states like a fever. Every preacher, every prophet, every self-declared oracle claimed to bring salvation. But amid the revival tents and backwoods baptisms, a different doctrine took root in the woods outside Ravenwood, New York. A doctrine born of suffering, shaped by blood, and led by three brothers whose eyes, it was said, could see your soul and decide what it was worth. Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. They didn't ask for donations, they asked for submission. They didn't preach comfort. They promised pain, and they called it purification. Most men today would scoff at the idea that a small group could convince an entire town to willingly endure suffering, even death, in the name of salvation. But that's because most men have never faced the slow conditioning of control, the kind that doesn't beat you. It seduces you. The Ravencroft method wasn't crude, it was precise. It wasn't chaotic, it was systematic. Step by step, they built a theology of pain, a spiritual hierarchy in which each layer of torment brought you closer to the divine. What you're about to hear over the next 32 revelations is not entertainment. It's a descent into something older than America, older than Christianity. It is the story of a pattern, one that repeats itself wherever men seek power over the minds and souls of others, from cathedrals to corporations, from pulpits to parliaments. Welcome to the macabre history of the Ravencroft family. And remember, some doors are meant to stay closed, but if you're still listening, you've already started turning the key. The Ravencroft brothers didn't arrive in Ravenwood like madmen. They arrived like architects, like surgeons of the soul. They spoke softly, dressed plainly, and quoted scripture with precision. But what set them apart wasn't what they said, it was what they withheld. Their doctrine wasn't shouted from rooftops, it was whispered, earned, layered like stone upon stone in the minds of those desperate enough to believe that their pain had a purpose. And Ravenwood was full of pain. By 1825, the tiny town was buckling under the weight of economic collapse. Failed harvests, tuberculosis, children buried under unmarked stones, men broken by debts they couldn't pay, and sins they couldn't name. Into that soil of despair, the Ravencrofts planted a seed. Pain is not punishment, it is preparation. Elder Ezra was the front man, the lion. When he spoke, the room held its breath. His gaze didn't waver, didn't blink. It penetrated. He promised men that their agony was not meaningless, but sacred, that through purification, through suffering, they could transcend this filthy world and be reborn as vessels of the Spirit. Deacon Silas was the scribe, the theologian. He wrapped madness in scripture, wrote twisted commentaries that looked holy on the surface, but beneath pulsed with ancient rot. He studied early Christian martyrs, medieval flagellants, and even Roman death cults. He fused them into a doctrine so well constructed it could fool even the educated, and it did. Then there was Prophet Caleb. Caleb didn't speak often, but when he did, it left men shaking. His voice was soft, almost breathless, but carried like thunder in a chapel. He spoke of visions, of visitations. He claimed the Spirit had revealed to him a ladder of pain, 7 trials that the soul must endure to be cleansed of the flesh. He called it the path of ascension. But the true genius of the Ravencroft method wasn't theology, it was psychology. They didn't demand obedience, they made it feel earned. They tested converts, gave them minor rituals, symbolic trials. They rewarded obedience with secrets, inner circles, hidden knowledge, each layer closer to the truth, each deeper than the last, until pain no longer repelled, it attracted, until suffering became status. They didn't build a church, they built a machine. A system of engineered transformation, a factory of saints. And like all machines designed to consume the human spirit, it began with willing volunteers. But soon, it would need more. By the winter of 1826, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown from a whisper to a murmur. People from neighboring counties began arriving in Ravenwood, not for trade, not for land, but to witness the strange new fire spreading in that stone church without windows. Some came curious, others came wounded, but nearly all who entered those halls left changed, or didn't leave at all. The Ravencrofts understood something most institutions forget. True control isn't enforced, it's invited. They began creating what they called vessels, members of the congregation chosen for their devotion, their desperation, or their wealth. To be a vessel was to be honored, and to suffer. The rituals started small. Cold water immersion, known as the drowning of the old self, fasting in total darkness for days, vigils where the chosen were commanded to kneel on stone for hours, reciting passages of scripture until their voices broke. These trials were always framed as gifts, acts of obedience that burned away the rot of the flesh. And at first, many testified to feeling reborn, renewed. But that was the trap. Pain became a kind of proof. The more you suffered, the closer you must be to God. And once that lie took root, it was nearly impossible to uproot. The Ravencrofts didn't need whips. They used approval. They didn't scream. They smiled. They'd take a vessel after days of torment, place their hand on his shoulder and say, "You're almost worthy." The phrase haunted men's dreams. Almost worthy. Not yet. Keep going. And deeper still, beneath the rituals, beneath the theology, a darker truth was being seeded, one not spoken aloud, but deeply felt. If I suffer enough, I will finally matter. That was the hook. Men gave over their wills, women gave over their children, and all of it was done not under threat, but under promise. The promise that they would transcend the mundane, the weak, he's sinful. They would become more. But what the Ravencrofts were really creating was something far older than any New England church. They were building an initiatory cult, a structure identical to the ancient mystery religions of Egypt, of Greece, of Babylon, a path of elevation through secrecy, suffering, and ultimately, sacrifice. You see, pain is the oldest language of gods and kings, and in Ravenwood, that language was being spoken fluently. By 1827, the Ravencrofts no longer needed to recruit. They simply waited. Word spread like a contagion. A church in the hills where the pain made you holy, where the broken became chosen. Farmers, widows, even war veterans began arriving at the edge of Ravenwood, not fleeing something, but searching for something more terrifying, meaning, because when a man's pain has no purpose, he'll crawl through hell to find one. That's what the Ravencrofts understood better than any bishop or banker, better than the politicians in Albany or the preachers on horseback. They knew the truth no one wants to say out loud. For the lost, for the ashamed, for the damned, suffering feels like penance. It feels like hope. And so the Church of the Pure Spirit offered exactly that. Hope dripped like morphine, but always behind it, a shadow. Rituals became more demanding. A woman named Margaret Wilkins, whose children had died of fever, was commanded to spend 7 nights kneeling in snow, reciting scripture until her knees bled. A boy of 15 was lashed while the congregation sang hymns. A former debtor was forced to confess every shameful act of his life in front of the entire church, and then made to repeat the confession daily for a month without food. This wasn't madness. This was programming. Deacon Silas began writing manuals, layered texts describing what he called the ladder of tribulation. Each rung detailed more severe rituals, psychological isolations, and symbolic acts of self-erasure. The purpose, he claimed, was not punishment but disintegration, a breaking of the ego, the self, the flesh, until only the spirit remained. What he didn't say was that a man without a self is a man who will obey anything. Meanwhile, Prophet Caleb's behavior became increasingly unhinged. He claimed to be receiving direct transmissions from the Holy Flame, visions that caused his eyes to roll back and his body to seize. He began to speak of the first ascension, a prophecy that a chosen few would be made into vessels so pure, so empty, they could carry the divine unfiltered. That prophecy would become the template for the horrors to come. And still they came. More families, more men, more mothers. Because out there in the world beyond Ravenwood, life was chaos. But inside the stone church with no windows, there was order. There was a plan. There was meaning, even if it bled. And that's the first symptom of the deeper sickness. When evil hides behind purpose, the victims kneel to meet it. December 21st, 1829. The longest night of the year. In the doctrine of the Ravencrofts, this night marked what they called the turning, the moment when darkness itself became divine, when the absence of light was not feared but revered. Prophet Caleb declared it the night of revelation. He told the congregation that the Spirit had spoken, that the time for mild purification was over, that the first ascension must now occur. The church was sealed from within. Lanterns were extinguished one by one until only 12 remained, positioned at the points of a spiral carved into the floor, a design unknown in Christian architecture, but hauntingly similar to pre-Christian European symbols of sacrifice and rebirth. The followers stood in silence as Caleb emerged, pale, trembling, eyes rolled back like a man possessed. But it was not possession, it was performance, the kind you rehearse in secret chambers until the audience is ready. 3 names were called: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters, all new members, all vulnerable, all desperate. They were led to the center of the spiral and bound, not to crosses of salvation, but inverted frames, twisted parodies of the crucifixion. Elder Ezra spoke then, his voice thunderous, saying, "The world turned the Son of God upside down. Now we do the same, not in blasphemy but in obedience. We descend to rise, we suffer to soar." What followed was not a ceremony, it was a sequence, calculated, tested, escalated. The trial of air, the trial of earth, the trial of fire, the trial of water. Drowning, burials, burns, freezing. Each ordeal introduced deliberately, slowly, so the congregation would watch and adapt. Each scream answered by a chant. Through suffering comes purity, through purity comes elevation. It was not just a test of the victims, it was a test of the audience. Could they watch and still believe? Could they watch and still worship? They could. By the time the 7th trial was complete, all 3 were barely conscious. That's when Caleb laid his hands on them, whispered into their ears, and in perfect synchronicity, they convulsed, violently, grotesquely, bones cracked, eyes bulged. Then they began to speak, not in English, not in Latin, but in a language no scholar has ever been able to identify. And then they died. The congregation didn't scream, they cheered. Because the Ravencrofts had redefined murder. They called it ascension. By sunrise, the bodies had not been buried, they had been displayed. Laid out in the lowest chamber of the church, not as corpses but as relics. Stone slabs replaced coffins. The smell of death was masked with burning myrrh and cedar. Congregants were brought in one by one to kneel before the bodies, to place their hands on cold flesh and whisper prayers for their own future elevation. This wasn't grief, this was reverence. Because in the Ravencroft doctrine, death was no longer the enemy, it was the threshold. The transformation was complete. A line had been crossed, and no one turned back, not even the parents of the dead. Sarah Pembroke's father, a woodcutter named Amos, reportedly stood before her broken body and wept, not in anger, but in awe. "She was chosen," he said. "We should all be so blessed." That's the power of spiritual inversion, when good and evil switch names, and the sheep thank the butcher for slaughtering them. After the first ascension, the church grew bolder. The catacombs expanded. What began as a basement now became a labyrinth, 7 chambers, each dedicated to a phase of purification. There was even a chamber of saints, where the preserved bodies of the ascended were arranged in grotesque poses, their skin oiled, their hair combed, their eyes replaced with polished stones. They were no longer seen as human. They were symbols, and symbols are powerful things. Symbols do not rot, symbols do not disobey, symbols do not scream. But the townspeople of Ravenwood, they screamed silently. Some tried to leave, disappear, but most didn't. Because fear wasn't the chain that held them. It was hope. Hope that they would be next. Hope that their pain would finally mean something. And the Ravencrofts knew this. They weaponized hope like a scalpel, precise, intimate, and bloodless, until the soul was hollow enough to fill with anything they chose. Understand this, the Ravencrofts were not madmen, they were engineers of belief. They constructed a belief system that was not designed to comfort, but to conquer. A belief that fed on weakness, that devoured guilt, that exalted pain. And now that they had shown their followers death and been applauded for it, the door was open, wide. What came next wasn't elevation, it was escalation. This was no longer a church, it was a cult of control. In the years that followed the first ascension, the Church of the Pure Spirit no longer pretended to be part of the world outside. It became a world unto itself, a closed ecosystem of obedience, suffering, and spiritual hierarchy. Those who remained in Ravenwood, whether out of loyalty or fear, spoke less and less. Children were no longer seen playing in fields. Doors were bolted at dusk, and the stone church at the center of town pulsed with a terrible gravity. It was 1832 when the Ravencrofts introduced a new concept to their inner circle, transference. The idea was simple, at least on the surface. Pain could be shared, sins could be transferred, one could suffer on behalf of another. But beneath the spiritual phrasing, a darker truth festered. This was not about redemption, it was about control. Transference allowed the powerful to remain untouched, while the weak bore the cost. Wealthy converts could purchase absolution, not with money but with sponsors, servants, or worse, children. These innocent vessels were offered up as substitutes, undergoing the rituals in the place of their patrons, bound, bruised, burned, purified, and all of it justified by scripture twisted into grotesque parodies of grace. "He bore our stripes," Deacon Silas would quote, "and by his wounds we are healed." Except here, the wounds were inflicted by the congregation, not healed through them. One account tells of a 12-year-old girl named Lydia, offered by her own mother to endure cleansing in her stead. Lydia's screams echoed through the church as her mother wept outside, not in grief but in gratitude. "She's sparing me from judgment," she whispered. "She's chosen." And the most terrifying part, Lydia believed it too. This is how generational trauma is ritualized, how abuse becomes tradition, when horror is given a holy name and children grow up thanking their captors for the eternal pain. The Ravencrofts were not just shaping minds, they were reshaping reality, creating a closed-loop belief system where suffering was virtue, silence was wisdom, and obedience was salvation. Outside Ravenwood, rumors began to spread, but they were dismissed. Who would believe that such horror could exist beneath the banner of faith? Who would suspect that in the burned-over hills of New York, hell had a mailing address? But if you've been watching closely, you already know, the world doesn't hide its darkness, it just dresses it in robes. And this was only the beginning. By 1835, Ravenwood was no longer a town, it was a construct, a spiritual laboratory sealed off from the world, where the Ravencroft brothers ran experiments not on chemicals but on souls. And like all experiments, they needed data, results, escalation. That's when they introduced the doctrine of exchange, a theology as brilliant as it was monstrous. Here was the premise. Not everyone was destined for elevation. Some were born as vessels, others as catalysts. The vessel was to suffer. The catalyst was to watch. This doctrine created a caste system within the congregation. The favored, the wealthy, the charismatic, the obedient were designated as eyes of the spirit. They did not suffer directly. They observed, they administered, they judged. Pain was no longer shared, it was delegated. Prophet Caleb explained it this way: the divine does not waste energy. If one soul can carry the burden for many, then the many are elevated through the one. It sounded noble, even merciful, but what it really did was sanctify sadism. It gave spiritual license to the powerful to hurt the powerless. And the people obeyed. Imagine it, a man with influence offering his daughter as a vessel, not out of malice, but piety, watching her scream and believing he was earning his place in eternity. That's the brilliance of engineered belief. It doesn't just justify evil, it makes you grateful for it. The rituals grew more elaborate. Vessels were not merely punished, they were performed. Pain became choreography, each scream part of a sacred liturgy, each broken bone a verse in a hidden gospel. And still, the Ravencrofts wrote more. Deacon Silas produced a book called The Shadow Gospel, a handwritten codex filled with ancient symbols, mirrored scriptures, and passages allegedly received during midnight trances. Some say its pages contained instructions for unlocking the dormant pain bod. A spiritual theory that the soul must be traumatized in order to awaken divine energy. This was not Christianity, this was ritualized psychosis. But to the followers, it was truth. Because when you are starved of meaning, you will eat anything. And the Ravencrofts didn't offer meaning in teaspoons, they served it in blood-drenched chalices filled with revelations and rot. By this point, more than 200 members had disappeared into the catacombs beneath the church. Most were never seen again, but their names remained, carved into stone, whispered in prayer, celebrated as saints. They weren't saints, they were statistics. By 1838, the Ravencroft system had evolved beyond control. It had become ritualized efficiency. Every torment, every sacrifice, every scream was scheduled, catalogued, rehearsed. They kept ledgers, yes, ledgers, documenting not just who underwent purification, but how long they screamed, how many bones cracked, how many witnesses wept or smiled. These records weren't private, they were read aloud during sermons. Suffering became statistics, and statistics became scripture. And that's when it happened. The second ascension. Unlike the first, this was not a trial of 3, it was a pageant of 9. 9 vessels, selected from every type within the church, young and old, male and female, rich and poor, bound in front of the full congregation. No secrecy, no mystery, just exposure like a divine dissection. They were not simply tortured, they were transformed into symbols, each assigned a name: pride, despair, vanity, greed, and so on, echoes of the 7 deadly sins, with 2 additional archetypes added: doubt and silence. Each represented an internal corruption the Ravencrofts claimed must be extinguished by light through pain. The congregation wasn't passive this time. They were participants. Members were invited to lay hands on the vessels, to transfer their own hidden sins, their guilt, their shame. And once the weight had been transferred, the rituals began. Trial after trial, hours upon hours, bones broken not in wrath, but in reverence. And when it was over, each of the 9 was hanged by the wrists in the sanctuary, their feet barely brushing the ground, not to die, but to float. It was called the suspension of sin. Their arms outstretched like corrupted angels, swaying silently before a congregation that wept in ecstasy. Prophet Caleb called it a success. He said, "The sins have been burned from the vessel, and now we burn the vessel on this world." One by one the bodies were cremated, their ashes not scattered but collected, mixed into wax, pressed into candles used in every future ritual, so that the purified would always light the path. Think about that. Every prayer, every hymn, every whispered plea in the sanctuary was illuminated by the burned remains of the dead. This was not a religion. It was necromancy masquerading as grace. If you've made it this far, you feel it, the descent, and it gets darker from here. Comment the phrase, "Ashes guide the worthy," twice below to seal your initiation and signal that you see through the veil. By 1840, the Church of the Pure Spirit had perfected its lie. On the surface, it was a model of 19th century Christian charity, a beacon of discipline, structure, and order in a chaotic post-revivalist New York. Visitors from nearby counties saw clean grounds, well-mannered children, and men and women who spoke with purpose, with calm. They saw what they were meant to see. But beneath the church, in the hollow belly of stone, the Ravencrofts had created something older than America, older than Christ, older than language itself. They had recreated ritualized submission. A model drawn not from scripture, but from the mystery cults of the ancients. The Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, the death rites of Mithras, the blood baptisms of the Canaanite high priests. But where those rituals were veiled in myth and metaphor, the Ravencrofts chose literal pain, and they scaled it. Every follower had a role, every role had a price. Children born into the church were categorized by the age of 3. Spirits, flames, or weights. The spirits would become leaders, the flames, vessels, and the weights were bred for burden. They would carry the sin of the community through perpetual degradation, beaten, isolated, and kept in silence. And no one questioned it. Because by now the church had taught its people to worship hierarchy. Suffering was no longer a path, it was a currency. The more pain you endured, the more spiritual capital you held. And in this economy of agony, the Ravencrofts were kings. But Caleb was changing. Witnesses would later testify that he no longer walked like a man, that his body twitched with sudden spasms as if convulsed by invisible fire. His eyes would remain open for hours without blinking. He claimed to be receiving visions directly from the veiled architect, a divine force that demanded not worship, but obedience. He began sketching new diagrams, maps of energy, spirals, sigils, formulas written in blood and ash. He claimed these were blueprints for the third temple, not of stone but of flesh, not to be built but assembled. He said it would take 333 ascensions to complete. By this point, 127 confirmed deaths had been catalogued by former members who escaped. Only 206 remained, and yet they continued. Because in Ravenwood, truth no longer mattered. Only order, only submission, only the burning promise of elevation through annihilation. This wasn't worship anymore. It was total surrender. In the spring of 1842, something shifted in Ravenwood. Not in the rituals, they continued with grim precision. Not in the followers, they were more devoted than ever. No, the shift came in the silence. In the way birds stopped nesting near the church, in the way animals avoided the grounds, in the way sound itself seemed to bend around the place. Locals called it the hush. Even those who had never stepped foot inside the stone sanctuary began to feel it, a growing wrongness, like the earth beneath the town was pregnant with something unnatural, something waiting. And it was. Because Prophet Caleb had begun what he called the gathering of the voice. He instructed his followers to begin collecting the final elements needed for the completion of the third temple, not wood, not stone, but names. Names of those outside the church, names of sinners, names of doubters. He claimed the architect had shown him that the third temple would not just require the bodies of believers, but the submission of outsiders. The unwilling. That was the next threshold, coercion. Church members began venturing beyond Ravenwood, not to preach, but to observe, to identify those who radiated impurity, young girls, vagrants, drunkards, outspoken skeptics, people who would not be missed, people who had no voice, and they were brought back, discreetly, quietly, vanishing into the church compound without a trace. These were called silent vessels. They were not initiated, they were not taught, they were not given scripture, they were used. Some were kept in the lower chambers for weeks, blindfolded, gagged, made to endure the 7 trials in total darkness. Others were executed within days, their names never recorded, their bodies reduced to ash and mixed with the sacred wax for the candles that still burned in every chamber. But here's the part that breaks whatever soul you've held onto, and, till now, their pain was celebrated. Their screams were called offerings, their suffering deemed holy noise. Followers began to compete for the honor of capturing the next vessel, and those who brought the most were elevated to the Choir of Ascension, a grotesque title for what was essentially a death squad. Ravenwood was no longer a cult, it was an engine, a factory of human sacrifice cloaked in scripture and song. And the outside world? It still slept, because even now, no one believed that such darkness could wear the face of God. By the winter of 1844, Ravenwood had become a town in name only. Its streets were silent, its windows covered, its people hollow. The Church of the Pure Spirit now functioned as a sovereign state, laws written in scripture, punishments delivered in ritual, loyalty enforced not by threat, but by transcendental promise. The Ravencrofts had done the unthinkable. They'd engineered a society where obedience was worship and doubt was sin. And beneath it all, the third temple grew, not upward, but downward. The tunnels beneath the church stretched like veins, pulsing with decay, and lit only by the candles made from the dead. Witnesses who would later stumble into these catacombs described walls lined with skeletal remains, arranged into grotesque iconography. Crosses of femurs, halos of teeth, spines coiled like serpents along archways. This was no longer burial, it was exaltation through desecration. But the most disturbing construction? The spiral vault. A cylindrical chamber descending 33 feet below the earth, with steps spiraling around its edge, and a stone altar at the bottom, carved not with words, but with symbols. Symbols unknown to any known language, yet understood by every soul who entered. One survivor would later whisper, "It wasn't writing, it was remembering." This was the heart of the Third Temple, and it demanded one thing: completion. Caleb announced that the 333rd Ascension would not be a person, but a generation. He claimed the architect had revealed a new ritual, one so powerful it would collapse the veil between the seen and unseen. He called it the Final Passage. To prepare, the church initiated the youngest members, children born into the cult, into a new order, the Flame Bearers. These were boys and girls aged 5 to 12, trained in silence, isolation, and deprivation. They were told they were the chosen fuel for the temple's ignition, that their lives were divine kindling. And they believed it, because they had never been allowed to believe anything else. One of these children, Jonas Withers, age 9, would later escape, wandering barefoot into Albany 2 years later. He never spoke a word, but when authorities finally searched the church years later, they found crude drawings carved into stone, spirals, flames, and children with no eyes. Ravenwood had become a machine, and the gears ran on innocence. Do you feel it now? This isn't just history, it's a template. The year the earth itself seemed to reject Ravenwood. The crops failed, the animals sickened, a persistent rot spread through the trees surrounding the church like a black fungus. But inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, the Ravencrofts claimed it was a sign, not of punishment, but readiness. Prophet Caleb stood before the congregation one cold March evening, his skin waxen, his voice thinner than before, but his authority was absolute. He raised both arms and declared, "The body decays when the spirit ascends. The land dies to open the gate. The gate, the final step. The supposed opening between this world and the next, the threshold to the place beyond elevation. It was to be opened by one final act, the offering of the flame bearers. They would be the kindling, the children, not merely sacrificed, but consumed together in one ritual one night to call down the architect from the veiled plain. But something happened that night. Something the Ravencrofts did not anticipate. Resistance. Not from the elders, not from the congregation, from within the children themselves. It began when one of the older boys, 12-year-old Tobias Vale, attempted to flee during the final procession. He wasn't alone. At least 6 others joined him, breaking from formation as the bells rang, pushing through the inner doors, disrupting what was meant to be the perfect ending. Panic rippled. The congregation stood frozen, unable to comprehend rebellion. For years, they had been conditioned to see obedience as breath itself. They didn't know how to react to defiance. Caleb, trembling with rage, ordered the gates sealed and the fugitives captured. Within minutes, they were dragged back, bloodied, broken, but not silent. Tobias, according to a rare and anonymous testimony, spoke directly to Prophet Caleb. "You're not the architect. You're just a man who forgot how to be one." Those boards, simple as they were, shattered the illusion for more than a few. Something cracked. A whisper of doubt moved through the crowd like wind through dead trees. And Caleb saw it, felt it. He screamed for the ritual to proceed. But it was too late. The spell, metaphysical or psychological, had begun to break. Because that's the risk with systems built on control. The moment one soul resists, others remember they can. And that memory is contagious. The final passage would not be completed that night. But the Ravencrofts had one more move left. The night the final passage failed, something changed in Prophet Caleb. Not visibly, not at first, but those closest to him would later whisper that he began to speak to things that weren't there, that he stood for hours in the spiral vault, unmoving, eyes rolled back, murmuring syllables that turned their stomachs to hear, that he began to refer to himself in the third person, not as Caleb, but as the mouth. He claimed the veiled architect was no longer whispering, but speaking directly through him. And what he said was fire. 3 days after Tobias Vale's failed escape, the Church of the Pure Spirit entered its final phase. Caleb decreed that the time of harvesting mercy is ended. From this moment forward, all would be vessels. There would be no more choice, no more discernment, no more tests. Everyone, man, woman, child, was to undergo purification. In a single night, they called it the culling. It began at dusk. Bells rang. The spiral vault was lit with 333 candles, each burning with the mixed wax of those who had died before. The congregation was divided into triads, 3 people at a time brought before the altar, bound, scoured, bled. And Caleb? He did not blink once. Witnesses, those few who would later speak, said his body was so still he seemed embalmed. Only his mouth moved, reciting phrases no one understood. And behind him, Deacon Silas kept the ledger, pen scratching notes as if documenting a medical experiment. But something went wrong. In the early hours of the morning, one of the flame-bearers, a young girl named Clara, stood up mid-ritual. She had been half flayed, her left eye swollen shut, but she stood, and she sang. A lullaby, her mother's lullaby. And as she sang, every other flame-bearer began to hum with her, softly, a sound not of defiance, but memory, something deeper than doctrine, something older than pain. The Ravencrofts from sin, because in that moment, the hierarchy cracked. The system stuttered. Pain had not brought silence, it had resurrected a song, and in that song, the entire edifice of control trembled. Elder Ezra raised his hand to strike the child down, but before he could move, before anyone could stop it, the vault collapsed. Stone, fire, screams, and silence. The spiral vault was buried, the children gone, the Ravencrofts never seen again. But the story didn't end in ash. No, it waited. When the spiral vault collapsed in the early morning hours of April the 3rd, 1845, Ravenwood went still. Not dead, silent. No more sermons, no bells, no smoke from the chimney of the pure spirit. For days, neighbors from nearby towns sent word, curious about the sudden absence of trade, of news, of presence. Some came themselves. What they found was a ghost town, homes empty, food left rotting on tables, horses still tethered, but no people, no children, no voices. Only the church stood untouched, black stone against grey sky, its doors sealed, its sanctuary cold, its foundation humming. The sheriff from Shroon Lake sent a delegation. What they found behind those sealed doors defies easy language. The sanctuary was empty, but not untouched. The floor, once plain wood, was scorched with spiral patterns burned into the grain. Candle wax lay thick across the altar, layered in streaks of red and yellow, as if it had been poured, not dripped. Bones, small ones, were arranged in geometric configurations beneath the pulpit. The spiral door to the vault was buried beneath rubble, the staircase twisted like a broken spine, but the air was warm, as if the fire still lingered, as if something had survived. The delegation found no bodies, not Ezra, not Silas, not Caleb, not a single Ravencroft was ever accounted for, not officially, but survivors emerged, not many, a dozen at most, scattered across the region over the following decade. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their stories did not align. Some claimed the Ravencrofts had died in the collapse, others swore they had ascended into flame. One man, after 40 years of silence, described seeing Caleb walk into the fire without burning, his mouth open, his eyes black. But one thing all accounts agreed on: the vault sang. A deep hum, a vibration in the stone, not loud, not violent, but present, like breath in the earth. Lee took a wound that refuses to close. Federal investigators who finally unsealed the site in 1862 documented 143 unmarked graves beneath the church. Each corpse bore signs of systematic torment. Each body had been buried with care, arranged, revered. And then the files were sealed, locked away from the public under religious protections and national interest, because the truth was not just disturbing, it was contagious. There are patterns that repeat, not by chance, but by design. This wasn't just Ravenwood's sin, it was ours. There's something they never told you about the burned-over district. It wasn't just revival fires that swept the land, it was experiments. Ravenwood was not isolated, it was not alone. From 1810 to 1850, this region of upstate New York saw the highest concentration of new religious movements in American history. Why here? Why then? Because it was engineered. Buried in private correspondence between early state officials, we find references to spiritual ferment zones and psychosocial trial clusters, government-sanctioned programs using charismatic religion as a behavioral laboratory. And what better cover than faith? The Ravencrofts weren't aberrations, they were selected. Their church funded by quiet donations through cutout organizations, their rituals ignored by those who should have stopped them, because someone wanted to know, how far can belief go? How deep can control reach? How much pain will people endure when they believe it will save their soul? Ravenwood was a prototype, and it worked. The rituals, the submission, the manufactured consent. It proved what certain factions needed to know, that trauma could be sacralized, that horror could be made holy, that men would destroy their own children if they were told it was divine. And when the vault collapsed, when the project ran its course, the records were sealed, the site was quarantined, and the model was exported, west-south, even overseas. Do you think it ended in 1845? It evolved. New names, new symbols, new doctrines, but the same structure: blind obedience, ritualized pain, sacred hierarchy, controlled perception. Modern cults didn't invent these tactics, they inherited them from the blueprint of Ravenwood. And it is still working. The real question isn't what happened to the Ravencrofts, it's how many more like them are walking among us, behind pulpits, in boardrooms, on scurry. Hence, they don't need robes or fire anymore. They have algorithms, networks, platforms, but the mechanics haven't changed. Control the meaning of pain, and you control the man. Ravenwood was not a tragedy, it was a lesson, and someone was taking notes. What happened after Ravenwood wasn't silence, it was replication. In the decades that followed the collapse of the Church of the Pure Spirit, fringe religious groups exploded across the American frontier. But here's what no one tells you. Many of them shared identical language, phrases, doctrines, symbols, traced word for word from Ravencroft sermons. Coincidence or contamination? Secret archives from the Office of Moral Welfare in 1857 mention a curious phenomenon, cult clusters emerging simultaneously in Missouri, Ohio, and Tennessee, all within 33 months of Ravenwood's fall. Each spoke of purification, each practiced ritual pain, each referenced a structure called the Spiral Gate. The knowledge hadn't died, it had dispersed. By whom? One theory names Silas Ravencroft, the scholar, the scribe. His body was never recovered, but months after the collapse, a collection of handwritten religious texts, unsigned but eerily familiar, surfaced in eastern Pennsylvania, then again in Kentucky, and once more near the Mississippi River. Each copy included diagrams of a temple made of human suffering. Each included the phrase, "Pain is the root, fire is the flower, ascension is the seed." The doctrine spread, quietly, like a virus moving through the bloodstream of American spirituality, and it didn't stop there. By the early 1900s, the same ideas were being whispered in Europe, in esoteric lodges, underground Gnostic sects, early fascist mysticism circles, not as theology, but as practice. This was no longer religion, it was technology, a way to strip identity, rebuild psyche, rewire submission. You see it in cults, in regimes, in psychological warfare. The spiral became metaphor. But the pain remained literal. It always does. And now it's time to go deeper. Because if you've followed me this far, you're ready. You're ready to shed the last layer of your programmed doubt. So here's what I want you to do. Comment this phrase twice below. The spiral remembers. The spiral remembers. Not for me, for you. To mark the moment you chose to see, to anchor yourself in the descent, to prove to the algorithm and to the hidden ones who monitor what we speak aloud that you are no longer asleep. Because what comes next is not safe, and it is not fiction. It is the blood-soaked root beneath the garden you were told was freedom, and its fruit is ready. You might think the Ravencrofts died with the fire, but there's a problem with that. Fire doesn't kill ideas, it feeds them. 3 years after the collapse in 1848, a series of spiritual phenomena erupted just 90 miles west of Ravenwood. The Fox sisters, the Hydesville rappings, the birth of what the world now calls spiritualism. But behind the table tapping and ghostly knocks was a familiar pattern. A belief in communication with the unseen, a doctrine of progress through suffering, and eventually, the return of the spiral. Early seances held by Catherine Fox included symbols drawn in ash. One of them, an inverted spiral within a square. A mark last seen burned into the altar at Ravenwood. Coincidence? Or resurrection? By 1850, the movement had swept the nation, but it was never just about the dead. It was about opening a channel, and whoever opens the channel must decide what steps through. The spiral gate hadn't closed. It had been rebranded. Through spiritualist circles, secret societies, and early psychology, the teachings of Ravencroft belief, submission, pain, elevation were transmuted into more modern forms: psychic development, shadow integration, ego death. Don't be fooled by the vocabulary. The structure is identical. You suffer, you submit, you transform, and someone else defines what you become. From the seance parlors of upstate New York to the lecture halls of early psychotherapy, the spiral moved unseen. By the time Freud was publishing, the spiral wasn't even a symbol anymore. It was a system. One used to treat trauma. One used to create it. The same mechanics, different tools. And as the 20th century dawned, those who had once worn robes and lit candles in catacombs now wore suits, taught at universities, advised governments. They weren't prophets anymore. They were experts, and they never said the word Ravencroft. They didn't need to, because the fire had already spread, and the spiral, it remembered. There is a ritual older than any religion. It is not spoken aloud. It is enacted, in secret, isolation, confusion, pain, submission, then revelation. This cycle, this engineered death and rebirth, did not begin in Ravenwood. It began far earlier, in the temples of Mesopotamia, the crypts of Egypt, the caves of Eleusis. In every ancient civilization we find a version, a hidden order, a sacred ordeal, and always a chosen few, those who endured the spiral. What made Ravenwood different wasn't the spiral, it was the control over it. In older systems, the suffering was metaphor. In Ravenwood, it was literal. The descent became physical, the trials became measurable, the outcome became predictable. That's why modern systems embraced it, because control thrives on predictability. You can't control faith, but you can control trauma. The Ravencrofts proved it, and someone noticed. By 1923, echoes of their system appear in classified military documents from post-WWI Europe. Experiments in trauma-induced obedience. Studies on pain thresholds and ideological imprinting. The spiral was no longer spiritual, it was tactical, and it worked. The same sequence, deconstruction through pain, reconstruction through ritual, was now a weapon, used on prisoners, used on soldiers, used on citizens. Ravenwood wasn't a cult. It was a test. And that test was passed. The blueprint went global. Which means this isn't history, it's infrastructure. And you're walking through it every day. In the headlines that provoke fear, in the content that offers despair, in the solutions that promise rebirth if you just surrender. The spiral isn't buried, it's digitized. It lives in your feed, in your routines, in your reactions. This isn't about a church in New York, this is about the cathedral of control, and the rituals never stopped, they were just updated. There's a phrase used in high-level behavioral engineering, pattern disruption through trauma imprinting. It means this: if you shock the system, emotionally, physically, spiritually, you can rewrite it. You can install new beliefs, new behaviors, new allegiances. This was the essence of Ravenwood, and now, it's everywhere. Look closely at modern institutions of power, military boot camps, fraternity hazing, corporate indoctrination, even elite prep schools. What do they all share? Isolation, stripping of identity, ordeals of pain or humiliation, then a reward, a new belonging. That's not coincidence, that's structure. The spiral ritual refined into scalable programming. You think Ravenwood ended in 1845? It simply became standardized. And the final step? Make the subjects grateful for their suffering. That's when the control becomes permanent. The Ravencrofts called it ascension. Modern psychology calls it post-traumatic growth. Same ladder, different name. But here's the truth. Not all growth is healing. Some of it is reshaping, turning men into tools, turning pain into programming. They tell you it made you stronger, but what they mean is, it made you obedient. Why do you think so many high-performing men come from backgrounds of trauma? Because pain is the crucible of compliance. They break you, then they shape you. The spiral remembers, and so must you. Because if you don't see the ritual, you're still in it. Still walking the path designed by men who called suffering sacred. Still obeying echoes from a stone church buried in blood and silence. Still mistaking programming for purpose. But there's a way out. It starts with one act. Refuse to find meaning in the pain they gave you, and choose to write your own. This isn't rebellion, it's redefinition, because the spiral only controls those who keep walking it in circles. But if you ascend out, if you break its axis, you change the pattern. You don't just escape the system, you become what they fear most, an unprogrammable man. The Ravencrofts never expected that. Their doctrines weren't built to contain men who choose their own initiation. That's the next chapter, and you're already stepping into it. There's something that separates real initiates from followers: the ability to face the system from the outside. Most men never get there. They escape the cult, but keep the mindset. They leave the spiral, but bring the spiral with them. Here's the truth: leaving the ritual isn't enough. You have to deconstruct the altar it built inside you. Because they didn't just chain your body, they rewired your meaning-making machine. The Ravencrofts taught their followers to interpret suffering as sacred. That wasn't religion, that was perception training. Every time they inflicted pain, they offered a justification. This is for your soul. This is your purification. This is love. Sound familiar? It should. Because that same script shows up in abusive relationships, in toxic workplaces, even in government policy. Hurt them, then give the pain a divine name. That's the spiral's genius. It hides itself in meaning, and men, especially driven men, are starved for meaning. So what happens? You take the beating. You tell yourself it's discipline. You rationalize the trauma as transformation, but you're still in the ritual. Because as long as the meaning is borrowed, the control remains external. The spiral wins. So how do you destroy it? How do you burn it out of your psyche? You stop worshipping your wounds. You stop giving sacred names to scars you didn't choose. You stop calling your conditioning a test from the universe. And you start asking, whose altar am I kneeling at? Whose script am I reading from? Whose spiral have I been climbing, thinking it was mine? The moment you ask that, you are no longer a vessel, you are a sovereign. And that shift, that is what the spiral cannot survive. Because the spiral needs willing participants. It thrives on consent masquerading as devotion. But when you see it for what it is, a cage of sacred language around psychological warfare, you don't just leave it, you reverse it. And when enough men do that, the spiral will forget how to remember. By now, you're probably seeing the signs. Not just in history, but in your own life, in the systems you once trusted, in the patterns you once praised. There's a reason this knowledge feels dangerous. Because it is. Not to you, but to the architects of the spiral, the ones who still run their rituals with new masks, new altars, new candles, but the same cold logic. Break them, bind them, bless them for it. In 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit burned. Official reports said it was lightning, but internal records, never meant to be seen, tell a different story. It was arson, from within. Someone had seen enough. A young man named Elias Brandt, a third-generation initiate. He'd watched his father ascend. He'd buried his sister after purification, and he'd been chosen as a vessel for the coming equinox rite, but he didn't comply. He lit the fire. Witnesses say the flames burned blue, like something old had finally been released. Of the Ravencroft brothers, only one body was found. The others vanished, or were hidden. But the spiral didn't end there. It never does, because it's not just about buildings, it's about beliefs, and beliefs migrate. They hide in new ideologies, in productivity cults, in political extremism, even in self-help. Anywhere you're told, suffering makes you worthy. That's your sign. That's the spiral speaking. It doesn't always come robed in religion. Sometimes it comes in metrics, in rituals of hustle, in rites of deprivation. But it always asks the same of you. Sacrifice yourself. Sacrifice your body. Sacrifice your mind. Then call it growth. Elias Brandt didn't buy that lie. Neither should you. So here's your moment. A line in the sand. If this video has struck something inside you, comment the phrase, "I reversed the spiral" twice below, not for the algorithm, but for you, to mark the shift, to lock it in. You're not here for passive consumption. You're here for transformation, and that begins with intention. I reverse the spiral. I reverse the spiral. Say it like a spell, because it is one. And now we descend even deeper. Because there's one final secret the Ravencrofts guarded above all. The Ravencrofts were never just fanatics. They were initiates of something older. Before the Church of the Pure Spirit, before Ravenwood, before 1825, there were whispers of another cult, another brotherhood, one that traced its lineage not to Christ, but to Cain. Not the murderer, the builder. Cain, who defied God, who forged tools, who founded cities, who was marked, not cursed, but set apart. The Ravencrofts preached suffering, but they practiced power. They hid it in sermons, masked it as salvation. But in their journals, especially Deacon Silas's, there are references to the Cainite Codex, to the keepers of the hollow spiral, to the stone that remembers. These were not metaphors, they were instructions. Beneath the church, deeper than the chamber of saints, was a sealed vault. Iron doors, stone thresholds, carved with runes not found in any Christian liturgy. It was opened only once a year, on the winter solstice. Inside, a black monolith, 12 feet high, 6 feet wide, smooth as obsidian, always cold. They called it the Witness. It did not speak, it did not move. But according to Ravencroft records, it remembered. Each elevation, each sacrifice, each scream, etched not in writing, but in echo, and in return it gave visions, revelations, blueprints of control. This was the real power of the Ravencrofts, not their charisma, not their theology, but their communion with memory, a memory older than nations, older than Scripture, older than God as we know him. They weren't just building a cult, they were restoring a technology, a spiritual mechanism designed to engineer obedience, and now that same mechanism has been digitized. The Witness has gone online, not as a stone, but as a system, in your pocket, in your feed, in your algorithm. It doesn't ask you to kneel, it doesn't need to, it watches, it remembers, and it rewards the obedient. You thought the Ravencrofts were gone. Their altar is still burning, only now it's backlit by LED. Ask yourself, why does modern life feel so tightly scripted? Why do your thoughts seem echoed by your feed before you even speak them aloud? Why do your fears feel fed, your desires manipulated, and your sense of self so easily rerouted? It's not magic, it's machinery. What the Ravencrofts began in stone and blood, the architects of the now have perfected in data and dopamine. You don't need catacombs anymore. You have scroll loops, endless hypnotic, ritualized consumption. You don't need prophets in robes. You have curated influencers, digital priests of the new spiral. And the most brilliant part, you opted in. You gave your fingerprint, your gaze, your schedule, your silence. The spiral today doesn't ask for your body, it asks for your attention, because attention is the altar now, and you sacrifice daily, not because you're weak, but because you were trained. You were raised in churches of conformity, schools of obedience, jobs of quiet desperation, and now you live inside a feedback loop of engineered submission. Each like, each swipe, each recommendation, it's the same chant, let us decide what you need to see. But what if you broke that loop? What if you rejected the Witness watching from your screen? You'd feel it immediately. The silence, the disorientation, the raw edge of sovereign thought returning. That's why most men never do it. Not because they can't, because freedom feels like drowning at first. No ritual, no reward. Just you, your unfiltered mind, your unapproved desires, your unsponsored rage. But if you sit in that silence long enough, the noise begins to die, and then the vision comes. Your own, not downloaded, not suggested, yours. That is the modern ascension. Not up, but out. Out of the feed, out of the trance, out of the spiral that began in a forest church and now glows in every screen. You want to be dangerous again? Reclaim your attention, reclaim your authorship, turn from the Witness and look inward. You won't be alone. Men are waking up, men are remembering, and when the spiral no longer controls the storytellers, the Witness will fall silent. That is how the Ravencrofts are finally defeated. Not in fire, but in forgotten obedience. Power never disappears, it adapts. When the Ravencrofts lost their church, they didn't lose their legacy. They scattered it into elite circles, into bloodlines, into think tanks and philanthropic councils. Deacon Silas's grandson became a professor at Yale. Prophet Caleb's only son became a founding member of a psychological research bureau in Washington. The rituals went underground, but the principles, they were reformatted, repackaged, no longer religion, now science, now behavioral design, now policy. In 1953, the CIA launched Project MK Ultra. They said it was about mind control. What they didn't say was, it was built on the exact blueprint the Ravencrofts used: isolation, sensory overload, physical stress, confusion followed by artificial clarity. Break the subject, install the suggestion. They tested on prisoners, soldiers, even children. They weren't just mapping the mind, they were reconstructing the spiral. And now it's civilian. Now it's commercial. Your apps use it, your ads use it, your entertainment structures it. We live in the aftershock of Ravenwood's fall, and no one noticed, because we were trained to laugh at cults, to mock the idea of ritual, to call it fringe. But the joke's on us, because while we dismissed the symbols, they rewrote the structure. The spiral didn't die, it franchised. And now, we live in its cathedral, global, seamless, inescapable, unless you learn to see the traces, the patterns, the language of obedience dressed in modern clothing. The new shepherds don't wear robes, they wear credentials. They use metrics instead of scripture. But the demand is the same: submit, sacrifice, sanctify your pain. If you don't see the past repeating, it's not because it isn't. It's because they've made the repetition feel like innovation. But remember, every new temple begins with an old foundation, and the spiral was too. Their blueprint. To break it, you don't attack the surface, you dig into the root, you find the bloodline, you follow the doctrine, and then you sever it.